All right. Hello there and welcome to the There I Said It channel. For today's video, I'm going to be talking about something that extends beyond Nigeria but also affects Nigeria, something that affects Africa. Right? Now, the topic of this video for this particular set for this stretch, I'm largely going to be giving a bunch of information I've done research on. I have no opinion on this matter yet because the only blueprint I've seen of it is one that works. I don't know how it would translate in the context of Nigeria because it has something to do with other countries. It has to do with uh, other cultures, and I'm not sure how well Nigeria would perform sharing something like this with other countries. That's basically it. So here's a bunch of information on ECO or ECHO, the unified currency that ECOWAS wishes to introduce, and hopefully the hope for echo, let's stick with calling it echo. The hope for echo is that it will create this sort of unified currency and strengthen the Western Africa's position, financial and economic position, right? It's on par with the European Union's euro, right? So it's basically the same principle behind the two, and there are several benefits of it. So let's start with what ECHO is meant to be. ECHO is meant to be a shared currency between the nation states within the ECOWAS region. Now, initially, ECOWAS is an economic and financial institution that was created to strengthen the economic stance and the economic strengths of the countries or member states of the Western African region, right? And so, what it naturally makes sense that they would want to introduce policies that would eventually lead to doing this better. And one of that is the echo, right? So the echo would be a shared currency. That would mean that nation states would not have to bother with the hassle of having to exchange currencies each time they get to a different country. Investors would find it easier to invest across the region, so it will lead to a more unified investing plan across the region. What other benefits did they have? Yeah, so there are several other benefits that it has. I wish I could tell you that now. Let me give me a second. Yeah, so one of the things you could do is to encourage trade between member states rather, and then it would reduce exchange rate risks and lower transaction costs. It would also increase investments, reduce currency conversion difficulties, as well as other things. Now, some of the reasons as to why these countries might not be on board, some countries might not be on board with switching over to a more unified currency, is that they would lose a lot of individuality, a lot of sovereignty in terms of controlling their economic and monetary policies. Say, for example, they would not have complete control over their monetary policies, some economic policies, and several other aspects that have to do with money and finances, especially with how they make decisions that affect their own individual economies. It would be largely affected now by the euro, right? And so this was a reason as to why some countries may not want to. But now, while this idea was introduced in the late 1900s, I believe, it was introduced in the late 1990s, rather, let's say 1990s. That was when it was introduced. And around that time, they had a sort of like a two-phase rollout plan, and there were criteria set in order to test out whether or not echo would work out within the western region of Nigeria and how well it would work out, and whether or not countries were ready for echo to be rolled out and then implemented across its member states. Now, the original plan was this. First, they would roll it out in the WAMS, the West African Monetary Zone, and then they would roll it out in the WAMU, and that was the West African Monetary Union. So now, initially, the WAMS, WAMZ, that's the West African Monetary Zone, included about 4 to 5 countries: Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and two other countries. I think Gambia was involved, and okay, I've mentioned Sierra Leone. Those were the countries that were in the West African Monetary Zone, or the WAMS. I'm going to keep calling them the WAMS. The West African Monetary Zone, basically. So that was the first phase of the rollout plan. And then if that worked, if the use of echo worked within the WAMs for a certain period of time, then they would eventually take it over to the West African Monetary Union. I believe it was called WAMU. Now, the WAMU extended to other member states or nation states within ECOWAS at the time. Mind you, at the time, ECOWAS was 15, it had 15 states, and I think right now it has only 12 states, Burkina Faso and some other countries left in 2025, early 2025. So right now, ECO is being planned for just 12 states, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Now, let's see how the whole thing went in the first place. I mentioned ECHO was originally introduced in the late 90s, right? 1990s. Then it was originally meant to be rolled out at first in 2003, right? And there were conditions that were set. I think it was created, it was originally set in 1999 because it was 4 years later. The criterion, there were four major criterias and five secondary and six secondary criterias, right? Now, the four main criteria that was set for the rollout of Echo was that one, what were they? Hold on, let me check. Okay, so I'm going to read them out because it's a bunch of big languages, but I'm going to explain what they are and how it eventually turned out. So the four main criteria were: one, price stability of the low or single digit inflation. That is having a low or single digit inflation rather. Then sustainable fiscal deficits, limited central bank financing of government deficits, and adequate foreign reserves enough to cover imports. So these were the four main criteria, and the other six criteria, secondary criteria, they had to do with tax, they had to do with, let me see, they had to do with government controlling arrears, maintaining sufficient tax revenue, controlling the public sector wage bill, maintaining adequate public investment, exchange rate stability, and positive real interest rates. Now, as at so initially when they brought out the idea was we will test this out. Let's see if these countries in the WAMs were able to maintain their economies to meet these criteria, both the four and the six. The main ones were very important, the four and the six. And after 4 years, we'll see if, okay, whether or not these countries have been stable enough so that we can roll out ECHO. And mind you, a an important part of rolling out ECHO is that these countries that ECHO was to be rolled out in, was to be implemented in, were to make use of ECHO, had similar and somewhat similar and stable economies. It was very important. So these criteria were sort of like a unifying factor for them. So during the rollout of these plans, what happened was by 2003, it was found that hardly any of the countries met uh, all criterias, all four main criterias. Basically, I think it was only Nigeria that met most of the criteria at the time. Ghana, is it Gambia? No, it was Nigeria and Gambia for one criteria. But countries like Ghana, Sierra Leone, and the I think two other countries in the WAMs were did not meet some of these criteria in terms of having, with regards to like the central bank funding government deficits. A lot of these countries had been at that time were getting into a position where the central bank could not cover how much they, or rather they were depending largely on the central bank to cover how much they owed. They did not have enough in terms of foreign reserve. Is that what it's called? Yeah, foreign reserve. Yeah, that's it. And what else? Let me see. Yes, so inflation had also risen to a very large extent, and basically, the summary of it all was it was a very long article. I apologize for not being clear enough. So the point was that after that 4 years, there were numbers that showed that these countries had were either up or down the scale in terms of meeting some of these criteria, especially the four main criteria. At the time, a lot of countries had experienced a shift, or rather, a rise in their inflation rates. They were owing a lot, and most of the economies of the WAMs were not stable at all. Again, except Nigeria, which I find hard to believe. Sorry for deviating. I'm going to stop now. But except for Nigeria at the time and Gambia, Gambia was also one of the countries that was able to cover, that didn't have as much dependency on the central bank with regards to covering its government's deficits, right? So the numbers were here and there. I'm going to link a resource. I'm going to link to the article that was originally written about this and the numbers in the description of this video, so you can read more about it. So basically, that was the whole thing, right? And now, because the initial set of states, the zone, the region in which the Echo was originally supposed to be rolled out in, that was not successful. Because it wasn't successful, the currency could not be rolled out in other countries in the WAMI, right? So now, what do we have? The first run of this has failed, and they tried again in 2009, I believe 2015, and I think they were supposed to do it in 2020, but again the criteria were not met. Then COVID happened, and now we are hearing news. Actually, I think it's been confirmed on the government, our Nigerian government's finance page, Ministry of Finance page, that it's been confirmed that ECOWAS plans to roll out ECHO again in 2027. One of the things that we'll be looking out for this rollout is whether or not the countries that have been selected for the initial phase of the rollout will be will have met these criteria, the criteria for the rollout. That's one of the major things we'll be looking at. We'll also be looking out at which countries will be how do they say it, tapping into, or eventually this accepting the currency and implementing it in their own country. Because while ECOWAS might roll it out, not every country will accept it and begin to use it immediately. So that's another thing we will be watching out for. And the third thing is which states it will originally which countries will be the early adopters of this currency, and exactly what the framework is that they use to adopt it, what problems they'll possibly face, and what problems they'll face in the first place of even accepting this, what problems the nation states will face in accepting the currency in the first place. So there are a lot of parts to cover. Now, I like talking about whether or not this thing is advantageous to the country, to the economy, and how it will benefit the common man, because that's my main problem, right? How it affects us at the micro level. I think, from my perspective, I think it's a good idea, but I feel like this might be some form of, allow me to get personal for a second. It might be because my thinking veers towards what the euro is like, right? So, on a basic level, I found that it makes things a lot easier for people to travel between countries and simply spend, because currency has a way of unifying us. If I know that I'm going to travel to your country and I'm still going to be able to use the same money I found under my bed to buy something in the side of a street or something, I'm able to get it in your country, it would make trade in between the countries a lot easier. It would make movement a lot easier. It would make there are several other factors that are involved. It would make it easier, and I've not really gotten to see, as far as I've read, I haven't gotten to see the extremely bad parts of this, other than the loss of control in terms of financial control and economic control of the monetary policy and some economic policies of some of these countries. Other than that, there isn't much of a disadvantage to rolling out echo. So yeah, that's it for today's video. That's it for today's video. If you have any other thoughts, opinions on Echo, something I may have missed, because I feel like there were a lot more I could have read in terms of official documents, a lot more sources I was hoping to see news on Echo from that I may have missed, and a couple of information may have been dropped out. I didn't read much on the rollouts between 2009 and 2015. I'm hoping that when 2027 comes around and the whole thing eventually rolls out, I'm going to be armed with a lot more information on where it stands, why it stands the way it stands, and what countries exactly are pushing forward with Echo, and what their opinions are on the use of Echo. So please do let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinions. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think of Echo? Do you think it's beneficial for us or some other thing? My name is Arizura Korma, and I'm building a community of thinkers and builders. And if that's something you vibe with, please do follow along. Thank you. See you on the next one. Bye.